Good morning, good afternoon. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Daniel, the President and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. Thank you for joining us on this webinar. We've got a really interesting topic to discuss today, shaken and stirred. I think it's an appropriate way of describing what's been going on in the geopolitical scene over the last, certainly at least the last year. And so I'm really excited to have Chris, Sergey, and Anna here to talk about this topic and how it affects cybersecurity. So I'll let each of the panelists introduce themselves very briefly, and then we'll get right to it. So Chris, since you're in the upper left on my Zoom box screen, I'll start with you.
Hi, great to be here, Chris Painter. Been doing cyber in some form for over 30 years as a federal prosecutor doing cybercrime, then the mothership at Main Justice, the FBI, the White House, creating the Cybersecurity Directorate under Obama, then as the world's first cyber diplomat at the State Department, and since then been doing a number of things, including various boards, nonprofits, and consulting and research.
Great. Sergey?
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I am Sergey Shykevich. I'm leading threat intelligence at Checkpoint. Well, on our day-to-day, what I do is collecting and analyzing strategic, operational, and tactical intelligence about different types of attackers. My background goes also to different positions in the government in Israel and in private sector.
Great. Thank you. And Anna?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Anna Collard. I'm from South Africa, and I've probably spent the last 23 years in cybersecurity, and of those, the last 12 focusing on the human factor, so more around human risk management and cognitive security. I'm currently working for Know4, who acquired the company that I ran in South Africa called Popcorn Training. And I'm also the co-founder of an academy here in South Africa called the Mido Academy, where we try and create pathways out of poverty through emerging tech and cybersecurity skills.
Excellent. So let's dive right into the discussion. Geopolitics has always affected, even driven cybersecurity. I mean, that was true, Chris, like, for example, when we were, both in government together. But today's situation feels somewhat different. And maybe I'll start with you to just, sir, is that assumption right? What makes the current situation different if it is?
Yeah, and first, one of the things I forgot to mention is I just started a new venture with Jim Lewis and Helly T. Mark Clark called the Cyber Policy Group, so I should mention that. Yeah, I do think it's different. I mean, and first of all, I think people make the mistake of not thinking cyber is driven by geopolitics, and you're right, Michael. It always has been. When you look at uh, the problems we've had for, say, like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, they're not really just cyber problems. They're problems overall with those countries, and cyber is just one dimension of it. And it's not this bright, shiny object that's separate and apart from geopolitics. And you see that play out at the UN. You see it play out in our conflicts with these different countries and some of the malicious attacks that have been made, or even disruptive attacks that have been made. I think what makes it different now is it's all gone, and to use a phrase from the movie Spinal Tap, to 11. Everything has gotten much, much worse. And that's been exacerbated by the really rapid advance in technology, AI, and other things that I think make people even more aware of the technological change and dependencies. And I think one thing that is really different is the role of the U.S. has changed. I mean, the U.S. has always been sort of an anchoring point for the international community in terms of trying to promote more stability in cyberspace and try in terms of cooperation against various threats. And there's a lot of questions about that now, given some of the U.S. actions more generally, but just in terms of whether these partnerships will endure and be the same going forward, and whether Europe and others need to kind of create new centers of gravity or additional centers of gravity going forward. So I think all those things make this a much different time than we've seen in the past, or a much more unpredictable time, I guess I'd say.
Yeah, Anna, from your perspective, how does the geopolitical situation look? Is it shaken and stirred?
I think, to tell you the truth, Michael, like in Africa, we've always been, or at least the companies that I've been dealing with, quite pragmatic about things. So there's a big Chinese influence here on the infrastructure level. Like we've always had the telecommunications companies happily buying from China, not being too ideologically influences necessarily. It's more an affordability issue. At the same time, we also had Russia in Africa really being involved, like they do in the rest of the world, with influence campaigns, disinformation campaigns. And then we have the third, like the West, sort of, providing more of the governance stream. So we have these three streams that are influencing how things are playing out on the African continent with regards to digitalization in general and cybersecurity as well, obviously. I think where we are right now, though what's different now is that we kind of we still kind of, like we on the outside of the fence, like we don't feel the pressure that you might feel in Europe or even in the United States. In fact, this is a very personal anecdote, but in Cape Town, you hear so many European languages and people wanting to buy property in South Africa because they want to get out of Europe, funny enough. But from a cybersecurity point of view, I think where we really have to I guess like be more careful about or be more cognizant is that it does influence, right? If you buy from the Chinese, you cannot help but being ideologically influenced. And what I mean by that is that the government or decision makers in some of the countries do not necessarily have the understanding of what cybersecurity really means, and then they could be influenced to think of it as more of a national security authoritarian tool to control journalists or people that might not have the same I don't know, like that are of different opinions. So I feel what we have to do from an ethical point of view is really help with the capacity building amongst decision makers, policy makers, so that they understand what cybersecurity is and what it isn't, so that it can't get abused, which it has been. I mean, we have countries that just switch off the internet, if there's election issues or if they are, if people are unhappy. So Africa has a lot to learn from that point of view and be a bit careful about the influencing streams that are happening on the continent.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective, right? Of the the different streams from China, Russia, the West and other
Mm.
places, and how they fit together or don't fit together, how they,
Yeah.
rub up against each other. I mean, and another place where obviously a lot of this comes together is in the Middle East, right, Sergey, and Checkpoint headquartered in Israel. What is your perspective? Is the current situation, I mean, Israel's been in a quote bad neighborhood for a long time. But what makes the current situation different from your perspective?
So I think, first of all, we see that the cyber is much more integrated with all other types of operation, with kinetic, political, information operations. And we see it also in different stages of those operations of the warfare. It can be, in some cases, operational support and real-time tactical aid. For example, we see it a lot with cameras in the Middle East, that we see hack of cameras to support missile attacks. That's something new from doctrine perspective. Maybe some countries already did it, but we see it. We see cyber is used for narrative shaping, for long-term access and positioning, and direct disruption. I would say also something we see in the Middle East that now more and more countries, and especially US, starts to see and feel is because in the Middle East we are in cyber war for last 2+ years with Iran at least. And now all the small groups that I would say mostly previously operated in the Middle East, Israel, a bit Gulf countries, now they target US. And now that's kind of the shift that this threat became global, what was local. And I think that's one of my big takeaways, what I see in the change in the geopolitics, that there is no longer such thing as local threat, because on some day it will become a global threat.
No, that's really interesting. And I hadn't really thought about sort of the use of cameras for, targeting, which of course makes sense when you think about it. Um, I think, Anna, you and I have been serving on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on cybersecurity, and some of what you and I have been talking about in that space, right, are the how a lot of the assumptions that have underpinned cybersecurity and how we have approached cybersecurity have been upended, particularly by both geopolitical changes, but also technological changes, right? Um, and maybe I wanted to turn to you to start with, what are some of the long-held assumptions that you, from your perspective, are being challenged by the current situation, and how should we think about them differently?
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. So one of the assumptions I think is actually for us in the rest of the world, looking at the Middle East, particularly the UAE and how they handle the crisis, right? And I've just had a colleague that moved to Dubai only 2, 3 weeks ago, and he said it's incredible how resilient these governments are and how things just keep on going, and how in terms of sort of consulting work or professional services work, that just there's only about 10% of the work that's been affected in people not being able to do it. But what underpins all of that is the ability to do that securely. So cybersecurity has sort of become, in a way, a prerequisite to enable the resilience of these countries. And they've really proactively have invested in that, to be able to withstand what's been going on there right now and to deal with it in a very mature way. Something that in Africa we so behind, right? Like the cybersecurity is still seen as like a grudge purchase. Nigeria tried to implement like a the digital tax scheme to finance some of the security spend that they should do, and it was like a big uproar that they couldn't really enforce that. So we have a massive financial deficit, and lack of resources to even spend the kind of to spend the money, let's say bluntly, that is needed to create the resilience. And that's really, I find that if you look at it from an assumptions point of view, that cybersecurity is no longer an insurance or a grudge purchase. It's like it's an economic enabler and a prerequisite to allow for the necessary resilience. And I think this is what this current geopolitical situations is showing the rest of the world. In fact, I read an article yesterday on the way of coming back from the Namibian bush, that the UAE, again, that some of their biggest economic opportunities are in cybersecurity because of the situation, right? So this is really, I find, and also with the work we do, Michael, where we look at how do we finance, like how can we create basically financial resources to allow countries and sectors and industry that can't afford it to enable them to have the necessary security controls in place, by creating this sort of idea that cybersecurity is a common goods. It's a global common goods, and it needs to be looked at a common goods that is necessary for survival, really, right? So yeah, I think those are some of the assumptions, at least from my perspective, that I think are changing. And then the other one, which I've held this for many years, working in this, let's call it the human side of cyber, is that it is no longer only about technology or infrastructure. It's very much about human minds that are being, I mean, Sergey, you mentioned it, right? Like narrative attacks, sort of influencing campaigns. That is very much part and parcel of cyber warfare. In fact, the NATO came out with a super interesting paper, and they call it cognitive warfare. And this is way above when we speak about propaganda. Propaganda wants to change people's ideas about a particular politician or something like that. Cognitive warfare is really hooking into the tools and the systems that people use to base their beliefs on. And this is what's been happening, even before you have any sort of kinetic big outbreaks that we all see. This is very much silent, undercover. You can't really feel it or see it, but it's happening, and it's happening way before big crises happen. Yeah.
So I would just add to that in a couple of ways. One, I do think one of the changes, one of the assumptions is, and Anna, you mentioned this, is, there's always been this assumption that we need to do more capacity building, we need to fund this, that this is one of the things we need to do. And And I still think that's incredibly important. However, I think people are, countries are stepping away from that just because of all the conflict out there, the U.S. included. I think the U.S. has become more, I'd say, minilateral and bilateral and not necessarily supporting the capacity building initiative as much as I think will help them in the long run, because it just doesn't help the countries you're doing it for. It helps you too and respond to incidents. The other is, both commenting on what Sergey said and what you said, look, I'd love for a change to be that cybersecurity is actually being thought of as a cross-cutting real national security and economic priority. I would love that to be the case. I don't think that's the case yet. Um, and the times it's been the case, and Michael knows as well, we've been able to make some progress. When ransomware became a big issue that was not just a cyber issue, but people standing in line for gas or waiting for their hamburger or not getting their insurance, it became a political issue. When China was stealing a lot of intellectual property, which they still are, it became a political issue, and we were able to make progress. But usually, despite the rhetoric of countries, including the US, is saying this is an important issue, we're going to do stuff about it, we're going to have accountability for bad actors, we don't, because it's not really transcended that point. And that's what I hope will happen in the future. And the only silver lining of all the bad stuff that's going on, all the geopolitical upheaval, is that might accelerate people understanding why this is more important, including for the issue, the reasons you said on the information warfare part of it.
Yeah,
So
and
I would be
no, go ahead, Sergey.
Yeah, I will be happy. Yeah, like both Anna and Chris mentioned, information warfare is really one key point. I think now in the current ecosystem, some countries try to achieve kind of supremacy in the narrative. At least that's their goal, and they use cyber as one of the means. And I would like to point another thing. It's about the supply chain. In the recent wars and big conflicts, we see more and more targeting of different supply chain, and not always direct targeting of the government entities that you would expect. In many cases, both in Russia-Ukrainian war, in the Middle East, what we see is not direct targeting of the armies or the big government entities. Yes, there are attempts to do it, but those are much better protected mostly. There are attempts to target, like I mentioned, cameras in different countries that mostly are in a public space at all, or in controlled by private sector companies or something. In Russia, Ukraine, we saw a lot of targeting of logistical supply chain to Ukraine, for example, in different. It can be from connected really to food supply, wheat, or military supply. So I think that's kind of a new point, and it's very on a national level. It's very difficult to map out all the supply chain of this level. Even in the enterprise level, it's very difficult, and big enterprises having a lot of challenges. But when you look now on governments, I don't like to say impossible, but it's almost impossible.
Yeah, I think, and this actually raises a question that I think is really interesting to explore. I think there were images that people had, or at least, let me back up, that the cyber intelligentsia, the people that sort of wrote about this stuff in, War on the Rocks and other things like that, sort of had an image about what cyber war would look like, right? And we've now had two full-blown kinetic wars break out. The Russia-Ukraine war, the U.S.-Israel-Iran war. And while cyber has certainly played a really important role in both conflicts, the results have not looked like what a lot of people predicted, right? I mean, I think I'll shorthand it by saying I think a lot of people had Die Hard 3 or 4 or whatever that terrible movie was of the complete disruption to society and sort of everything being turned off everywhere and power grids going down. And that's not what's happened, right? It's actually been far more subtle, not absent, just subtle and different than what a lot of sort of theorists posited could happen. And so I'm interested to sort of get all three of you, get your takes on why is that? Why has cyber war sort of emerged in the way that it has? What are the conditions that are driving that?
Well, first of all, that movie featured a car ramming a helicopter. So how can you get better than that?
Well, that's true. I mean, I should say I love bad action movies, watch a lot of them on planes. So, I highly appreciate that. But yes, so.
Yeah. Secondly, the expectations were always out of kilter with reality. I mean, you know, Michael, well, um, the famous Cyber Pearl Harbor, Cyber 9/11, Cyber Armageddon, which was always, I thought, overhyped. And then when that didn't happen, you had people saying, well, we're having smaller Cyber 9/11s every day. It's like, oh, please, yeah, cyber is a big deal, and it is a big disrupt. It can be very disruptive, and the more we depend on it, the more it's a vulnerability for us. But it was always no. I don't think if you really thought about it, cyber was never going to be the decisive factor in a kinetic war. If you're going to target infrastructure, why burn a very hard fought and sensitive cyber tool that you have when you could just throw a bomb at it or a missile at it? You're going to do that. And it's going to be more effective, frankly. It's going to have more longer lasting consequences than cyber, which would likely be temporary. So I think the lesson from this is cyber is a part of every conflict and will be a part of every conflict going forward. And that makes more sense, right? That it's integrated as one of the tools, both in terms of the technical tool and in terms of the narrative tool that we talked about too. And you're going to see that going forward. Will it be the decisive factor when you're in a kinetic war? I don't think that will ever be true. Will it be something that's going to be an important tool, like disrupting of communications, like we saw in Russia's war on Ukraine before it happened? Of course, you're going to see that. You're going to see it during the war. Of course, you're going to see it to disrupt command and control. Are you going to see it go after weapon systems that are highly dependent on it? Yes, you'll see that. You see that already. So those things will happen. And we'll also see cyber continue to be used below the threshold of armed conflict, which we see all the time, which is still serious. I mean, it's not like that's something we shouldn't care about. And when we see the big infrastructure attack that we've talked about now for 30 years, you and I, well, for the last 20,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe we will. And I think right now, the people who could do that have been dissuaded because that really would call for a much greater response. I think deterrence is at least working at that level. Uh, but that's not the way that we should define the entire debate. And I think that unrealistic expectation made people say, oh, I guess cyber's not that important when the wars broke out, when in fact, what it shows is it's incredibly important because it's now integrated.
So I completely agree with Chris, and I think kind of we as defenders should do this shift that cyber is not a completely standalone weapon anymore, at least on the level of nations. It's another way to achieve different military goals or different strategic goals, even not military goals, but even strategic goals. It can be firing missiles, UAVs, doing some bomb explosion, or doing cyber. We also saw in Ukraine, for example, a lot of cases that there were attempts to both do bombing against, for example, TV station in Kiev and cyber attack altogether. And to be honest, in those cases, the physical kind of bombing was much more, let's say, impressive provided the bigger impact. Because as Chris mentioned, yeah, bombing now kind of 500 kilograms of explosive doing much more impact on for films, for TV, for informational warfare. So we should perceive cyber as another weapon and not a separate. I think that's kind of my takeaway from last war.
Yeah, Anna?
Yeah, I totally agree with Chris and Sergey. And then again, I think I mentioned it earlier on, Michael, is that a lot of this, let's call it narrative shifting and subtle information warfare happens during peacetime, way before you have big kinetic events. And I really believe, like, even if you look at some of the election outcomes in the previous years, that could have been thanks to some of the very much purposeful information warfare that has been happening, and that corrosion of trust, the polarization among societies. If you look at what China is doing very, very successfully against Taiwan, is they just want to break groups against each other. It's not about the actual message; it's about breaking the societal trust amongst populations, and this has been happening for years. If you look at Sergey mentioned the Ukraine Russia warfare. The fact that the Russians can recruit Ukrainian teenagers on Telegram and social engineer them to a level that those teenagers themselves, for 350 euros, will go and bomb, I don't know, a small building. That's information warfare, right? That is maybe doesn't hit the news headlines internationally, but that is very much the abuse of, well, again, calling it cognitive or the human factor at a level that is so subtle, but so much more dangerous, in my view, than a big cyber attack against a nuclear power station or something that we still talk about years later. So I think we have to very much be aware of this information warfare that's going on deliberately for years already and quite successfully.
Yeah, and
I
I
think
think, no, go ahead, Chris.
one of the problems, and Michael, you remember this too, is that traditionally the cyber people and the kind of information people are separate, at least in the US government. I think that's often true. When we had the election interference back in 2016, I think the cyber community was largely caught unaware by that. We
Yeah.
dealt with it, but it wasn't something we had on our radar screen. We had big infrastructure attacks. We had theft of intellectual property. We didn't really think about this as a threat because it wasn't really our hood, right? It wasn't the thing that we focused on. And you really need to look at this entire spectrum. And in fact, I think that's one of the things that we're seeing more now is this integration where people are looking at that full spectrum outside of cyber as well.
Yeah, and I think in the US political context, of course, it makes anybody who's from our era in the government very uncomfortable to talk about information warfare, right? Because that's not something the US government should be doing. Right. And it puts us, I think, that's one of the situations where our system is at a disadvantage because, frankly, we're not very good at it. And from a US government standpoint. So I think that's another issue in this blending of sort of sort of that cybersecurity area and the information warfare. That's an area where those of us that are cybersecurity experts are going to have to gain a greater facility with sort of those information, warfare areas. Although, I mean, and Anna, to your point, I have always long argued that like cybersecurity is as much a psychological problem as it is it's a human factors problem, right? As much as it is a technical problem. In fact, more. We typically don't design cybersecurity products very well for people to actually use them. That I think limits their utility and makes us more vulnerable. One of the things I did want to, oh, go ahead.
No, sorry. I was just, while you were talking, I was thinking whether it's somebody who gets social engineered to, I don't know, click on a phishing email or fall for a scam versus somebody who gets over time social engineered to believe a certain narrative. The manipulative tactics that are being used are very, very similar. And that is the good news about this is that when we then think about, well, what can we do to defend ourselves against this? Like, what can we do to vaccinate or inoculate people's minds against these types of information warfare attacks or social engineering attacks or scammers? They're the same tactics, and that's it comes down to again cognitive defense, resilience. Critical thinking, slow thinking, those sort of things that again, the Ukraine, Finland, Taiwan, they've identified that as a national security, prioritization that they have to help their people to become more aware of what it means to be manipulated. And that can help you then against the scammers and the typical, let's call them cybersecurity criminals that we defend our networks against, right? Whether that's the ransomware actors, who very often also start with a social engineering attack, right? Like, let's be honest, the kill chain, cyber kill chain always starts with a human doing something stupid, being social engineered. But so are the propagandists and the disinformation actors, and that's what I find why like I'm busy in my research is really looking at how can we build a model that helps us to defend against all of these sort of manipulative tactics. And I don't know if I shared this earlier on, but I'm in South Africa, but I was born in Germany, and obviously I'm maybe very much sensitized of what can happen if a nation is manipulated to the worst extent, right? But I think that's why I get especially passionate about this topic, because I can just see some of these playbooks being played out, that were used by the Nazis and groups like that.
Yeah, I think what's amazing to me is, when you read history and things, like many of these tactics, and they're not new. I mean, their manifestation through technology, through the internet is new, but the manipulation and other things, you read about some of the things that the Roman Empire did, and you're like, wow, that sounds kind of eerily familiar, the and so you realize that a lot of this is not, in fact, new, that it's been going on for a very long time. One of the
We used to call
go
when I was a
ahead.
prosecutor, that we used to call that old wine in new bottles.
Yeah,
That's
it's
or
the
Roman old wine and like new whatever
new wineskins.
amphora or whatever.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the other, geography obviously drives a lot of, geopolitics, right? Geography is fundamental to, the US's position in the world is greatly affected by geography. Israel's situation, South Africa's situation. Um, Sergey, from your perspective, what are some issues that people outside of the Middle East might not be aware of that you would want to highlight in this context?
So I think it's in the Middle East, it's very challenging to tell when the war starts and when it ends. I think
Mm.
that's the basic thing because when I'm asked for how long there is a cyber war, for example, between Israel and Iran, there are different variations. Some will say for the last 3 years, some will mention for 5, 6 years when disruptive attacks started, and some will tell it's since Stuxnet more than a decade ago. So it's a very challenging because at least in the conflict regions, you feel that are always part of the warfare. I think the same if you ask someone who is in Ukraine, he will tell the same that maybe since 2017, 16, when the conflict between Russia and Ukraine started, it's there. So I think that's one thing. Secondly, as I mentioned previously, I think even what starts as some local conflict, a local threat, can kind of propagate globally. Because even Iran, for example, yeah, most of their attacks up to last month or two was on Israel. But I think most in other countries even didn't hear that Iran already for 3 years constantly attacks with disruptive attacks Albania, an Albania government, which is also NATO member, by the way. But there are 3 consecutive years because Albania hosts some Iranian opposition there, for example. And now, with all of the sudden, with the war, see that there are kind of attacks against Stryker, a huge American corporation, against the private email of the FBI director, and more in the US, and more kind of questions what they try to attack or will try to attack. So I think that's the key. Always to consider and build your capabilities, not looking only on now, what you see now, what you think now, and also try to anticipate the future. And yes, it's difficult. It's definitely difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think, the complexity of the relationships that you mentioned earlier, like I remember during uh, the NotPetya outbreak from almost 10 years ago now, there was a hospital system in Northeast Pennsylvania that got caught up in that because they like, used some of the same companies that actually provided services in Ukraine, right? And who would have thought that like this hospital system would get caught up in that? Because there's no obvious connection there, and I think that's those unanticipated, almost unknowable, as you said earlier, sort of supply chains is really difficult to disentangle. Anna, from your perspective, I mean, you've mentioned a few things about, sort of the African perspective, from where you are in South Africa, but are there other, what are some other things that, people outside of that region might not be aware of that you would want to highlight?
I think, to be honest, Africa is it's such a big mix of different countries that are at different maturity levels. So some countries like Ghana, for example, even Mauritius, are actually pretty mature in terms of their cybersecurity. Let's call it adoption or sort of governance levels from the local governments prioritizing it accordingly. South Africa, unfortunately, I think we have great laws, but the enforcement is lacking, the resources are lacking. So the governments on the continent haven't quite grasped yet, and this is what I meant in the beginning, that we can really learn from the Gulf, like particularly the UAE, that cybersecurity is part of your national resilience and it should be seen as an economic enabler, particularly with the digitalization. So something that maybe people outside of the region might not appreciate is that our average age is 19 years old on the continent. So we have a lot of young people that are interested in technology. It's a very digitized or digitalization is increasing. The telcos see massive opportunity, but none of that will work if we don't equip the companies, the people with the right infrastructure and the necessary safety mechanism. So again, I feel cybersecurity is an economic feasibility enabler, right? None of
Right.
this opportunity will work, and the governments unfortunately have not caught on to that. Maybe because they have in their minds bigger fish to fry, whether that's youth unemployment, which again, in my view, so we have this youth that is relatively digitized. They're unemployed. South Africa's youth unemployment rate is 65%. That's massive. On the other hand, there's a huge, at least on the continent, there's a huge skill shortage. So we can combine those two problems together, right? By taking the youth that is interested in technology, giving them some form of skills, but also not just skills. It's more about work exposure and giving them projects that they can get involved with, so that they don't get tied into gangs and other crimes that will that obviously take from these unemployed youth. Um, yeah, I think I don't know if that's some of the points that people outside of the region might not be aware of. I think it's so hard to. I think that people might perceive Africa as this one big black country, but there's so many different, we have very much first world industries, and then there's third world poverty. There's areas where you don't even have access to electricity, let alone the internet. So there is that problem too. But then again, we have very flourishing IT sectors, the financial services, the payment structures, mobility, all of those are amazing digital opportunities that need more cybersecurity prioritized by our governments. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I'd
And
say
then
that one.
understanding what cybersecurity is. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we've argued this
Great
for
question.
years that the way to get people to pay attention, the way to get political leaders to pay attention, everyone in Africa and really around the world wants to have this digital transformation. They're saying that's going to transform our economy and societies. But to do that, you really need strong cybersecurity, and they don't really pay attention to that. And that's paralleled. Everyone likes the bright, shiny, positive things like the positive parts of AI, but no one is investing as much as they should be in how AI could help with cybersecurity. So the cybersecurity issue, and we've all seen this, has been a harder sell, but hopefully, when these things start integrating more, it won't be as much. Of course, I said that 10 years ago too.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it's, one of the things that I would say, Anna, just on that point, right? It's really amazing to me when you look at like the structure, for example, of digital payments, and what you can do in the digital payment world in countries like South Africa that you can't do here in the United States. I don't think people quite have the appreciation for how digitized many countries in Africa are, particularly in the financial sector. It's a very different world. And
Over,
that,
over 10 years ago, Kenya had M-Pesa, which is the payment system, and we
yeah,
did training. We did cybersecurity capacity building there. for the region, and they had tools that we just didn't have. You're right, Michael.
Yeah.
But it's the same here, obviously because I sort of I travel to Europe quite a lot because of family, but Germany is so behind South Africa in terms of the mobility and like I still have incidents in Germany where the taxi driver wouldn't take a credit card. It's so cash driven. Whereas here, I think the last time I drew cash is maybe 2 years ago. Nobody accepts cash anymore. It's all mobile payments, right? Um, and we had that before the Apple wallets and those kind of things. We have all these like they call it SnapScan and Zapper and all these apps that you can pay. Even the beggars on the street, the car guards, you can pay using your mobile phone, right? Yes, you can tip using your mobile phone because nobody has cash anymore. And I think that's true. Like that's maybe something that the rest of the world might not realize how digitized things already are. We take it for granted, And then I travel to Europe and I'm like, what do you mean you don't take a credit card?
Right.
Even the concept of a card for us is a little bit outdated because everything's on the phone, right? Like you pay. Um, but yeah, with that again comes the appreciation that all of these payment services and by the way, blockchain-based payments are also
Right.
quite big here because of the what's the word? Like the migrant workers that want to pay their family at home,
Right.
and then these financial services companies charge so much in fees that these kind of blockchain-based transactions are just so much more affordable. Remittance payments, that's what it's
Right.
called, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's interesting.
So we're getting close to the end of the webinar, and I think one of the things that I always like to do is to draw on a U.S. radio show called "Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me." So I will say, I will ask each of our contestants here on the webinar that if you had to make a prediction for something that will happen over the upcoming year, what would it be? And of course, if it actually comes true, we will track you down and ask you about it. So. Chris, maybe I'll start with you to wrap that up.
I won't say the world will end because then you couldn't track me down, but I'd
Well,
say
that's true. Yes.
so I'll say it's going to get worse. I think the geopolitics will get worse, which will drive everything. AI will not be the easy button that fixes all of that in the next year, although I think it has long-term promise. Quantum will still be 5 years away, which it always is, and I think I think the world will go on, but the role of the U.S. is going to be different inside.
Yep. No, I think that's very good. Sergey.
We still won't have accountability.
Wow. Sergey.
So Chris mentioned that AI will not be the button that will fix everything. I think it will be maybe the biggest accelerator of the attacks and the risk in the upcoming year. Because we see more and more, it's kind of cat and mouse game. Yes, defenders implement with Checkpoint and all other companies implement it, use it for the defense. But for attackers, it's always much easier because they need also only one success. And I think it will be definitely the year of more autonomous systems. We already saw some coming from China side, from other sides. So I think that's something we should kind of open our eyes for, especially in the context of the big conflict.
Okay. All right. Anna.
I think it's more of I'm putting myself under pressure, but because I'm driving or trying to evangelize for the concept of cognitive security, that maybe in a year's time, people will understand that cybersecurity is not only about digital infrastructure, it's also about our minds, and that becomes more of a mainstream understanding within our industry and how to provide cognitive resilience and security.
Well, thank you, all three of you. I think that, we've drawn out a lot of themes today about how a lot of the geopolitics of kinetic conflict are driving innovations in both, offensive cyber capabilities, but also cyber security. It's driving innovations in resilience. But I think that, as Anna points out quite rightly, that our resilience is not just about the digital resilience, but it's also about our mental resilience and how we operate in this digitized world, and how, the world is going to continue to evolve, and how I think cybersecurity will continue to be integrated more and more across a whole bunch of different disciplines, even if people don't realize that that's actually what's happening. I definitely think that this is going to continue to be an interesting topic area to work in, and I don't think any of us will end up being bored. So, well, thank you, Chris, Sergey, Anna. Thank you for joining us today, and I really enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to continuing it in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.